I think I do. Okay. I think it's recording. Great. So first, I just wanted to thank you guys for coming. It really means a lot to me that some of my classmates wanted to come and hear this presentation. It's mostly based off the master's program, which I did in Barcelona, focused on political ecology, degrowth, and environmental justice before starting here at NMBU. And so this is sort of my story of degrowth. Everybody's story is a little bit different, but maybe we all share some common definitions for what degrowth means. So I have those here, or some of them. Very simply put, degrowth is the hypothesis that we can avoid climate catastrophe, but we must prioritize people and the environment over economic growth. Maybe one way of saying this a little bit more complex is that degrowth involves a downscaling of production and consumption that increases human well-being and enhances ecological conditions and equity on the planet while decreasing the role of markets and commercial exchange in organizing human lives. That's a little more complicated, but hopefully by the end of the presentation, it will make a little bit more sense than it does now. And we can also keep in mind that slowing down the economy isn't an end into itself. It's not so much a goal, but more like an outcome of a transition towards equitable well-being and environmental sustainability. So with that in mind, we can get started. For me, degrowth really comes from two different ways of seeing the economy. So we can start with this one over here on the right, and we see a circle focusing on the buyers and the sellers, consumers and producers. Resources move from one direction to the other, goods and services go in the other direction, and money is sort of flowing around in a circle. And maybe as the basis of this neoclassical economic model is rational individual choice, free will. As you can see, there's a big focus on supply and demand. And the idea of this model of an economy is that it's based on growth. It will keep growing, and that's desirable and possible because of human ingenuity, because of increasing productivity gains, increasing efficiency. The idea is that this can make growth continue indefinitely. The other model, which we've seen referenced in class, sort of puts the economy at the center of a nested system. I think somebody's microphone is on and we can hear them typing. Maybe that's Oystein, if you don't mind to shut it off. So the economy is inside of the society, and the society is inside of the environment. And these are nested systems, and they're interacting with one another. So very important here is the interaction between different groups. And we think of the environment as a source for energy and material resources, where we get ultimately our energy and materials from, and then also a sink for our pollution. As we engage in economic activity, we are creating pollution in the production, in the distribution, in the disposal at different phases along the way. And the environment is seen as both a source for our resources and a sink for our pollution, and that's quite important. And the idea is that the economy will at some time, it will grow until it reaches some point which is desirable to level off in a sort of steady state, which is inside of biophysical limits, sort of we can think of this outer layer of the environment. We've seen this model before in class. This incorporates the Sustainable Development Goals into this sort of nested model with the environment on the outside and the society within inside that, the economy within that. But I think it's very important to point out a inherent paradox here. We have goal number 8, which stipulates economic growth both in developed and developing countries, both in the global north and the global south. Goal number 8 says that rich countries, industrialized countries, should grow at 2% a year, which would mean a doubling of the size of the economy every 70 years, whereas less developed, less industrialized countries, it says they should grow at 4 to 6% a year, I believe. But both should grow and continue growing. And to me, that immediately makes me think, so if the economy is growing, eventually it's going to hit the walls of the biosphere here, and we can talk a little bit more about what that might look like. Scientists have hypothesized as to these planetary boundaries, generally accepted to be 9 of them, but different people argue about which ones are boundaries and where the limit is. That's all up for debate. But I think for me, what's not up for debate is that there are some limits, and that we are surpassing them in some ways right now. Some of the ones that I have mentioned in class are we're now at 1.1 degrees of warming, and in the 6th mass extinction. Here they say our biggest problems are genetic diversity, biosphere integrity of the 6th mass extinction that I mentioned, and also biogeochemical flows, so our use of nitrogen and phosphorus, mainly for agriculture. Also, they're worried about land system change. Humans now occupy 70% of ice-free land. Sorry, not occupy, influence in some way 70% of ice-free land, and climate change is becoming more problematic. People have talked about a carbon budget, how much CO2 equivalent we can emit before going over this 1.5 or 2 degrees of warming. And now most people who study ecological footprint are saying, as a global community, we're occupying maybe the space of 2 or more Earths, whereas of course some countries are occupying the space of more than that on their own. So I think it's really important to take a step back and look at what we're really worried about here with climate change and with changing temperature. If we look at the past 100,000 years, we see parts per million of CO2 oxygen in the air, and we see temperature change. These two things are very correlated, of course, and we see a lot of variation in the past 100,000 years. Humans, we're anatomically modern humans, have existed almost for all of this time, but we didn't come up with agriculture until about 10,000 years ago. So we see this stabilization, which is known as the Holocene epoch. And in that time, we developed agriculture in many different places around the same time, and that has sort of led to the rise of complex civilization that we see today. So the fear is that by changing the concentrations of CO2 in the atmosphere, by changing the temperature, we will push ourselves out of this Goldilocks Holocene time. And actually the Earth system scientists are now saying we have left the Holocene and entered the Anthropocene, where humans have become the dominant force affecting the environment and pushing us out of this Holocene stability. The idea is not that we will fall off a cliff tomorrow and the weather will get worse. These Earth system changes take a very long time. The idea is more that we are pushing a button that is putting us into a new system that we then cannot get out of. If we don't, most scientists say if we're aiming for 50% reduction of CO2 by 2030 and net zero by 2050, and the idea is if we don't get this, we will move from this stabilized Earth into a hothouse Earth. We will cross some sort of threshold. There's a lot of these different thresholds or tipping points which are interconnected and characterized by feedback loops. They feed on each other. So maybe the simplest one to think about is the Greenland ice sheet, or any of our big ice sheets, which are reflecting light, heat rather, coming from the sun, reflecting it off the Earth and back into the atmosphere. As that ice melts, there's less reflective surface and more of the heat is absorbed, causing more of the planet to warm, melting more ice and continuing this cyclical process. Another example is the melting permafrost in Antarctica, or sorry, in the north of Russia. So when the permafrost melts, it's releasing this trapped methane, which in turn warms the climate more, releasing more methane, melting more permafrost. So interconnected systems characterized by tipping points. To get a little more in-depth into how we see the economy from an ecological economics perspective, everything is sort of matter and energy. So if you look around you in the room, there's your computer, there's a desk, there's all sorts of things made of materials, and they were also made using energy, and we use energy to power a lot of them too. So all of our economic activity and most of the things we interact with are made up of matter and energy. And we can recycle some of that matter and energy, or not so much the energy. You can see the little picture of coal here in the bottom. Once we burn the coal and it's a gas, it's very difficult to get that energy back. It goes from a low entropy state to a high entropy state. It goes from a very ordered state to a disordered state. That's the second law of thermodynamics, that matter and energy move from an ordered state to a disordered state. So again, we can recycle pretty well metals and some other materials, but we will never recycle 100% because of this law of entropy. And so from a weak sustainability perspective, we can think about how we're going to achieve sustainability by improving efficiency. So for every good thing that we consume, for every unit of consumption, we're doing it more efficiently now than we did in the past. This is true. And so the idea is that we can become sustainable by becoming more efficient, where a strong sustainability perspective would put much more emphasis on decreasing throughput. So decreasing this matter and energy moving through the economy, that would have to actually go down in absolute terms, not just in efficiency improving. Weak sustainability often talks about market-based solutions. So there was a presentation in this class, there have been a few about tacking on fees for making things more sustainable, markets for carbon, for ecosystem services and biodiversity. This is a market-based solution, whereas strong sustainability would focus on regulation rather than buying and selling the rights to pollute. We just have to have a regulation on how much pollution can be done and distribute that equally throughout different portions of society. Where weak sustainability might focus on technical solutions like getting an electric car instead of a gas-powered car, strong sustainability would focus on lifestyle change, less car ownership and driving less. Where weak sustainability might focus on a management solution, somebody like me who studied at a university coming in and saying what we should do, strong sustainability or degrowth usually focuses on direct democracy and people voting on decisions that should be made influencing their lives, more role of democracy in the workplace and different spheres of life outside of politics as well, rather than these managerial solutions from above, bottom-up solutions rather than top-down. So when we think about, can growth be green? Can economic growth be sustainable? This chart, I think, is very useful. So economic activity is increasing, we can see, and if it increases more rapidly than our use of energy and material resources, that can be called a relative decoupling or greener growth. But still, our use of energy and materials is increasing in this scenario, so it's not quite green growth, which would be an absolute decoupling of resources and energy from our economic activity. And yet, even that might not be enough, because even if we reduce our CO2 footprint by 1% a year here in Norway, for example, that won't be enough. We know we need to reduce it by maybe 5 or 10% a year or even more. So we could think of that as sufficient absolute decoupling. Is our energy and material use going down enough that we find ourselves within these planetary boundaries? And for material use, the situation looks quite bleak. There's no decoupling on a global scale or on national scales of material use from GDP. I don't have so much more to say about that. The case for CO2 emissions looks a little bit better. If we look at a country scale, we see that industrialized countries like the US and the European Union seem to have more or less flatlined or stopped increasing their CO2 emissions while the economy has continued to grow. So that is possibly absolute decoupling. The case becomes a little weaker when we look at consumption-based emissions rather than territorial or production-based emissions. So if something is produced in China but bought and used in Europe, should the emissions from the factory count towards China or towards Europe? That's the difference between territorial and consumption-based emissions. So maybe the emissions in Europe and the United States are going down because they're offshoring their production and the environmental effects of that. Or maybe we see some real decoupling here. But either way, I think there's not a strong case to be made that this decoupling is sufficient to keep us within 1.5 or 2 degrees of warming. So how can we think about how we live, how we can be sustainable in the future? This is from Kate Raworth. She is very famous for coming up with this donut economics model. So of course, we're going to use some energy and material resources in order to meet our basic needs. We can think of this as reaching our social foundation. But we don't want to use too much energy and material resources that we overshoot the ecological ceiling, some of these planetary boundaries that we've been talking about. So again, we can argue a lot about what are the planetary boundaries, where the limit is. Same for the social foundation. What constitutes a good life? What is necessary amount of consumption? These are things people can discuss. But for me, more important is the general theory, the idea that there exists some social foundation, that we all have a right to consume a certain amount, and also an ecological ceiling that we don't have a right to overconsume, and that actually infringes on the rights of others to meet their basic needs through basic consumption. We can look at how each country is doing in the world. Scientists have done this. You can see here the United States and Sri Lanka. If you go to this website, you can choose any country you want and look at how they're measuring up on different biophysical boundaries and social indicators. We see the US is doing pretty good for social indicators, except for in terms of equality and employment. Again, I would argue that democratic quality is not up to par in the United States with our two-party system. So of course we can argue about these specific things, but more important again is the main idea. And we can see that Sri Lanka has not met as many of their social thresholds, but they also have not surpassed any of their biophysical boundaries, where the US has surpassed just about all of them. And here we can see different countries with biophysical boundaries transgressed on the bottom and social thresholds obtained on the y-axis. And we can see, in general, the more social thresholds we obtain, the more biophysical boundaries we transgress, but this isn't always the case. Germany has achieved more social thresholds than the United States while transgressing less biophysical boundaries. And Vietnam is an outlier in having achieved quite a few social thresholds without transgressing many biophysical boundaries. So by thinking about how different countries operate through this new framework, we can start to get ideas of how we can satisfy our basic needs and keep people happy, focus on human well-being without destroying the planet for future generations, for our children. And finally, this is my last slide. We went pretty quickly, actually. Some degrowth policy proposals. So how we can think about moving from where we are now to the sort of future that I've outlined in these different pictures. One thing would be a cap on emissions and extraction. I talked about this direct regulation and reducive throughput. So scientists have already estimated, some have different estimates on what could be a carbon budget, how much we can extract and emit in order to reach this budget. And I think it's important that these rates are informed by natural rates of regeneration, but also by social equity. And they should be determined socially by social democratic processes, of course, not by scientists, not by technocrats or managers or from above. Another important point would be a redistributive ecological tax and subsidy reform. I think you guys have heard me talk a lot in this class about perverse subsidies, subsidies going towards fossil fuels, towards building roads, towards making cars and airplanes cheaper. It's something I'll talk about in my presentation later today when I try to relate some of these ideas more specifically to tourism as well. So removing these perverse subsidies and shifting our taxes from labor to consumption. So right now, a lot of our taxes come from labor. When you get a paycheck after having worked at the end of the month, some of that money goes to taxes. Whereas most of the really rich people in our society don't receive paychecks at the end of the month. They make their money through stocks and investments and in different ways. So if we were to instead tax consumption rather than labor and have it be a redistributive tax, people who consumed more would pay more in the tax because they consume more. And if we redistributed that tax, people who consumed less would end up not paying more for their goods and services because of the people who consumed more and were paying more in this tax. That would then be redistributed equitably. We can also think about a maximum and minimum income. I think a minimum income is a really common idea, but we don't think so much about a maximum income. But I think if I asked anybody who works in a company, how much should the highest paid worker, maybe the one who studied for 20 years, be paid in comparison to the janitor, the one who cleans the toilets? And some people will say 10 times more or maybe even 20 times more, but almost nobody will say that the top paid worker should receive 1,000 or 10,000 times more money than the lowest paid worker. And this is often the case with our shareholder corporation these days. So I think having a maximum and minimum income democratically decided, informed by social thresholds and planetary boundaries, is an important step. We've talked a lot today already about reforming national accounting, moving away from GDP as a metric of human well-being and the environment. Of course, there can be a lot of debate on what these metrics should be rather than GDP, but I think more important than that is looking for alternatives rather than all agreeing on what is the best measure. Maybe there's many best measures. Another thing that's very important is regulating banking and international commerce. So for the past, I think in the US, it's been around close to 30 years now, banking has been deregulated. So banks basically, when you take a loan from a bank, they produce that money as a loan and make their profit from you paying back the interest on that loan. It used to be, and they invest the money that you put in there to make more money. They're basically acting as the way private investment firms acted in the past. It used to be that only the government could produce money like that for a social reason. When I say government, I mean, I hope I mean society, the will of the people. So I think public control of money is very important, and regulating international commerce to end social and ecological cost shifting. So right now, companies can move across borders. They can pollute and even kill people, and maybe they have to pay a fine for that, but they don't actually have to go to jail. Whereas people can't move across borders unless they have a visa, and if they kill someone, there will definitely be a consequence. More than paying a fine, they will have to go to jail. So right now, it's the case that corporations are less regulated than people. There's more rules for people than there are for corporations, and I think it should be the other way around. We need much more regulation of international commerce, and workers should be more free to move where they want, regardless of these imaginary borders that we've put up to separate people. But I guess that's moving into a topic for another conversation. So the next one here is shifting productivity gains away from growth. So we do have these productivity gains. We are increasing our efficiency all the time, but right now if we increase our efficiency, we continue to work the same number of hours and we produce and consume more. Instead, we could produce and consume the same as we increase our efficiency, and we would have more free time in that case. So we can reinvest in free time rather than increasing throughput. And I think I sort of mentioned already the importance of direct democracy, and especially in the workplace. So rather than governments incentivizing shareholder corporations and what we think of as entrepreneurs today, they could incentivize workers, cooperatives, which are already an important part of many economies, and give more democracy in the workplace, give everyone a say, everyone who's working in the company a say in how it operates, and has been shown to create a lot more social and ecological benefit, even if not as much profit in the system as we measure it now. So to leave you with a few jokes, there's this nice little cartoon here that I just found I thought was kind of funny. A lot of people will be saying, of course, the recovery from Corona, we need to consume more and get the economy growing again. I think the only politicians in Norway who are not talking about economic growth is really the Green Party, something like 2% of the seats or less. I don't know well Norwegian politics, but even less prevalent in places like the United States. So almost all politicians and economists really go for this neoclassical growth-based model. But a little more, something a little happier to end, degrowth signals a radical political and economic reorganization leading to reduced resource and energy use. This hypothesis posits that such a trajectory of social transformation is not only necessary, but desirable and possible. So thank you for your attention and welcome any questions.
Thank you. Go on, Toril has a comment.
Is it in the chat?
Yeah, or I can.
Or you can stop the recording if you'd like, maybe, or I can stop the recording rather, sorry.